Welcome to the Story Vault, where Miss Marple unlocks captivating mysteries.
In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Manor, a scream pierces the night, and young Evelyn Ashford lies dead, poisoned by cyanide, in a locked library. Was it a jealous lover, a desperate family member, or a sinister stranger tied to a ruthless South American cartel? As secrets unravel and suspicions mount, only one mind can pierce the web of lies. Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster whose keen eyes and little gray cells see what others miss. Why did Evelyn die? What deadly truth did she uncover? And who, among the elegant guests, hides a murderer's heart? Dive into a classic Agatha Christie-style mystery, where every clue matters, and the shocking truth will keep you guessing until the final, breathtaking reveal. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Blackthorn Manor. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the hedgerows bloomed with late summer roses and the air carried the faint hum of bees, Blackthorn Manor stood as a monument to an older, grander England. Its ivy-clad walls, punctuated by tall, mullioned windows, loomed over the village like a benevolent but watchful patriarch. The manor had been the seat of the Ashford family for generations, and though its fortunes had waned, its reputation for hospitality remained untarnished. On this particular August evening in 1925, the manor was alive with the chatter of guests, summoned for a weekend of celebration to mark Sir Reginald Ashford's 60th birthday. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a cushioned armchair by the drawing-room window, observed the gathering with her usual quiet intensity. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to the murmur of voices. She wore a simple black dress, her silver hair neatly pinned, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing. To the casual observer, she was merely a frail spinster, a guest invited out of politeness by Sir Reginald's sister, Lady Clara Ashford, who had known Miss Marple's cousin in her youth. But to those who knew her well, Miss Marple's unassuming presence concealed a mind as precise as a Swiss watch, attuned to the smallest irregularities of human behavior. The drawing-room was a study in contrasts, opulent yet faded, its crimson wallpaper and heavy oak furniture speaking of wealth now stretched thin. Sir Reginald, a robust man with a florid complexion and a booming laugh, stood at the center, regaling a cluster of guests with tales of his investments in South American railways. His wife, Lady Beatrice, a statuesque woman in her late 40s, moved among the guests with practiced grace, her emerald necklace catching the light of the chandelier. Their daughter, Evelyn, a pale young woman of 22, hovered near the piano, her fingers nervously tracing the keys without playing a note. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Evelyn, noted. Attention shifted to the other guests. Dr. Maurice Langley, the family physician, whose spectacles glinted as he spoke earnestly to Lady Beatrice. Captain Hugh Rutherford, a retired naval officer with a weathered face and a tendency to clutch his glass too tightly. And Mrs. Violet Hargreaves, a widowed cousin of Sir Reginald, whose sharp tongue and sharper eyes darted about the room. There was also young Mr. Leonard Baxter, a solicitor from London, invited to discuss Sir Reginald's latest business ventures, and his wife, Sylvia, whose laughter seemed forced, her glances toward her husband laced with unease. The final guest, introduced as Senor Diego Alvarez, was an enigma. A sleek, dark-haired man in his 30s, he spoke with a faint South American accent and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. Sir Reginald had met him during a business trip to Buenos Aires, and his presence at the manor was a subject of whispered curiosity among the villagers. Miss Marple noted the way Alvarez's eyes followed Sir Reginald, not with admiration but with a calculating intensity. As the clock struck 8, Lady Clara clapped her hands, summoning the guests to the dining room. The table gleamed with silver and crystal, and the meal, roast pheasant, glazed vegetables, and a fine claret, was served with impeccable precision by the manor's small staff. Conversation flowed, though Miss Marple detected undercurrents of tension. Sir Reginald spoke enthusiastically of a new venture with Alvarez, something about importing rare timbers from Argentina, while Lady Beatrice's smile grew tighter with each mention of the project. Evelyn excused herself midway through the meal, claiming a headache, and Miss Marple noted the fleeting look of relief on her face as she left the room. After dinner, the guests returned to the drawing room for coffee and brandy. Miss Marple declined both, preferring to observe from her corner. She watched as Alvarez drew Sir Reginald aside, their voices low but urgent. Captain Rutherford, meanwhile, seemed to have drunk more than was wise. His face flushed as he argued with Dr. Langley about naval strategy in the Great War. Mrs. Hargreaves, ever the gossip, leaned toward Miss Marple and whispered, "Mark my words, Jane. That Alvarez fellow is no gentleman. I've heard things about those South American cartels. Ruthless they are, and Sir Reginald's too trusting by half." Miss Marple smiled politely, her mind cataloguing the comment. "People often reveal more than they intend," she murmured, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. She noticed Sylvia Baxter slip out onto the terrace, followed shortly by Leonard, their silhouettes tense against the moonlight. Marple, with surprising agility for her age, rose and followed at a discreet distance. In the library, they found Evelyn Ashford crumpled on the floor, her face ashen, a small vial clutched in her hand. Dr. Langley knelt beside her, his fingers searching for a pulse. After a moment, he looked up, his expression grim. "She's dead," he said quietly, "poisoned by the look of it." A gasp rippled through the gathered guests. Lady Beatrice clutched her husband's arm, her composure shattered. Sir Reginald stared at his daughter's body, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Evelyn, my girl." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she took in the scene. The open window, the scattered papers on the desk, the faint scent of almonds in the air. Not an accident, she thought. This was deliberate, and someone in this house knows why. As the guests stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and suspicion, Miss Marple's mind began to work, piecing together the first threads of a puzzle that would soon unravel the secrets of Blackthorn Manor. Chapter 2. The Shadow of Murder. The library at Blackthorn Manor, bathed in the dim glow of a single lamp, seemed to close in around the grim tableau. Evelyn Ashford's body lay still on the Persian rug, her delicate features frozen in a mask of agony. The small glass vial in her hand glinted faintly, its contents emptied, and the bitter almond scent of cyanide hung heavy in the air. Miss Jane Marple stood near the doorway, her slight figure almost invisible in the chaos of grief and shock that enveloped the room. Her sharp eyes, however, missed nothing, darting from the overturned chair to the open window, where a cool night breeze stirred the heavy velvet curtains. Sir Reginald Ashford stood rooted to the spot, his broad shoulders slumped as if the weight of the world had descended upon him. Lady Beatrice, her face pale beneath her rouge, clutched his arm, her sobs muffled but piercing. Dr. Maurice Langley, still kneeling beside Evelyn, rose slowly, his spectacles reflecting the lamplight as he addressed the room. "We must summon the police at once," he said, his voice steady but strained, "and no one should touch anything until they arrive." Captain Hugh Rutherford, his face flushed from brandy and emotion, muttered something about damned foul play and strode toward the window as if to inspect it. Miss Marple's voice, soft but clear, cut through the tension. "I would advise, Captain, that you leave the window as it is. The police will wish to examine it for signs of disturbance." Rutherford froze, his hand hovering near the sill, and turned back, his bluster momentarily checked. Lady Clara, ever the practical hostess, took charge, directing the butler, Mr. Grayson, to telephone the local constabulary. The guests were ushered back to the drawing room where an uneasy silence settled. Señor Diego Alvarez stood apart, his dark eyes unreadable as he lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the gloom. Mrs. Violet Hargreaves, her earlier gossip now replaced by a nervous energy, whispered to Sylvia Baxter, "Poison, my dear. It's like something out of a dreadful novel. Who could have done such a thing?" Sylvia, pale and trembling, glanced at her husband, Leonard, who sat rigidly in an armchair, his fingers drumming on the armrest. "I can't believe it," Sylvia murmured. "Evelyn was so quiet. Why would anyone—" Miss Marple, seated once more with her knitting, listened to the fragmented conversations, her mind cataloguing each word, each glance. She noted the way Leonard Baxter avoided his wife's eyes, the way Alvarez's cigarette trembled slightly in his hand, and the way Lady Beatrice's grief seemed to alternate with flashes of something like fear. Grief is natural, Miss Marple thought, but fear suggests knowledge. What does Lady Beatrice know that she does not say? The police arrived within the hour, led by Inspector Harrow, a stout man with a bristling mustache and a no-nonsense air. He was accompanied by Constable Reed, a younger officer who carried a notebook and a look of eager determination. Harrow surveyed the library, his eyes lingering on the vial and the scattered papers on the desk. "Cyanide, you say?" he asked Dr. Langley, who nodded gravely. "Almost certainly," Langley replied. "The smell is unmistakable, and the symptoms, convulsions, rapid collapse, are consistent. Death would have been swift." Harrow turned to Sir Reginald. "When did you last see your daughter alive, sir?" Sir Reginald's voice was hoarse. "At dinner. She excused herself around 8:30, said she had a headache. I thought nothing of it. Evelyn was delicate." "And this vial?" Harrow held it up, careful not to smudge any potential fingerprints. "Recognize it?" Sir Reginald shook his head, his eyes hollow. Lady Beatrice, however, stiffened, her hand tightening on her husband's arm. Miss Marple noted the gesture, her needles pausing briefly. "Interesting," she thought. "The vial is not unfamiliar to her." Inspector Harrow began his interviews in the library, calling each guest in turn. Miss Marple, invited to remain as a friend of the family, listened quietly from her corner. Sir Reginald recounted his movements. He had been in the dining room until 9, Rutherford, until the cry was heard at 10 minutes past 10. Rutherford corroborated this, though his account was muddled by drink, and he admitted to stepping onto the terrace for air at some point. Alvarez's alibi was precise. He had been with Sir Reginald until 9:30, then joined the others in the drawing room, never leaving except to fetch a fresh pack of cigarettes from his room at 9:45. Leonard and Sylvia Baxter claimed to have been together all evening, though Sylvia's hesitation suggested otherwise. Mrs. Hargreaves, with her usual flair for drama, declared she had been watching everyone and had noticed nothing unusual, except, she added, Evelyn's odd behavior at dinner. When it was Miss Marple's turn, she spoke simply, describing her observations of the evening without embellishment. "I am an old woman, Inspector," she said, her eyes twinkling faintly, "and I find that people often overlook me. But I do notice things. For instance, the library window was open when we found poor Evelyn, yet the night is cool, and the papers on the desk, some were crumpled, as if handled in haste." Harrow raised an eyebrow, but made no comment, scribbling in his notebook. As the interviews concluded, he announced that the manor was to be considered a crime scene. No one was to leave until further notice. The guests murmured their assent, though unease hung over them like a storm cloud. As the group dispersed to their rooms, Miss Marple lingered in the drawing room, her knitting abandoned for the moment. She approached the fireplace, where a small brass clock ticked steadily. 10 minutes past 10, she murmured, recalling the cry. And yet, the vial was empty, the poison already taken. How long does cyanide take to act? Seconds, not minutes. So why the delay in the cry? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft footstep. Turning, she saw Lady Clara, her face drawn. "Jane, you've seen things like this before, haven't you? In your quiet way. Do you think it was one of us?" Miss Marple's expression was gentle but unyielding. "My dear Clara, in a house full of secrets, it is rarely an outsider who strikes. But rest assured, the truth has a way of revealing itself if one knows where to look." As Lady Clara retired, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind weaving a tapestry of clues and contradictions. Watchful eye of Inspector Harrow's constables. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting resting lightly in her lap, her eyes scanning the guests as they gathered for a subdued breakfast. The clink of china and the murmur of strained pleasantries filled the air, but beneath it all lay a current of unease, as palpable as the damp chill seeping through the windows. Miss Marple had risen early, her habit of observing the world before it fully woke serving her well. She had taken a quiet turn about the manor's grounds, noting the dew-slicked grass near the library window and the faint scuff marks on the sill, as if something or someone had brushed against it. Not conclusive, she thought, but suggestive. Her mind, ever methodical, filed the observation away alongside the memory of Lady Beatrice's reaction to the vial and Sylvia Baxter's hesitant alibi. At the breakfast table, Sir Reginald sat at the head, his face haggard, his usual boisterousness replaced by a hollow silence. Lady Beatrice, dressed in somber black, picked at her food, her eyes darting to the door each time a servant entered. Dr. Maurice Langley, ever the professional, maintained a calm demeanor, though Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he poured his tea. Captain Rutherford, nursing a headache from the previous night's brandy, grumbled about the police poking their noses where they don't belong. Mrs. Violet Hargreaves, meanwhile, seemed almost invigorated by the drama, her sharp tongue cutting through the tension with observations about Evelyn's fragile nature and odd moods. Señor Diego Alvarez, seated near the window, ate sparingly, his dark eyes scanning the room with a predator's alertness. Leonard and Sylvia Baxter sat close together, but their silence was strained, punctuated by Sylvia's occasional nervous glances at her husband. Lady Clara, ever the dutiful hostess, attempted to keep the conversation civil, but her efforts faltered under the weight of the tragedy. It was at this moment that a new figure entered the scene, though not with the fanfare one might expect. Miss Marple's presence, already established among the guests, took on a new significance when Lady Clara, in a moment of quiet desperation, turned to her. "Jane," she said, her voice low, "you've always had a knack for seeing things others miss. The police are doing their best, but I can't help feeling they're looking in the wrong places. Will you help us?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the unassuming spinster. Captain Rutherford snorted, but Miss Marple's serene expression did not waver. "My dear Clara," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I am no detective, merely an observer of human nature, but if I can be of assistance, I shall do my best to bring clarity to this sad affair." Inspector Harrow, who had joined the group to announce the coroner's preliminary findings, raised an eyebrow, but made no objection. "The coroner confirms cyanide poisoning," he said, addressing the room. "Death occurred between 9:30 and 10 o'clock last night, likely within minutes of ingestion. We found no fingerprints on the vial, which suggests it was wiped clean. We're still searching for the source of the poison." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she listened, her mind turning over the timeline. 9:30 to 10, she thought. Evelyn left dinner at 8:30, claiming a headache. An hour and a half is a long time for a headache to lead to poison. She glanced at Alvarez, who had claimed to fetch cigarettes at 9:45. And where was he truly during those minutes? After breakfast, Miss Marple requested permission to view the library, a request Harrow granted with some reluctance, stipulating that Constable Reed accompany her. The library, now cordoned off, was much as it had been the previous night, save for the absence of Evelyn's body, which had been taken to the morgue. Miss Marple moved slowly, her eyes tracing the room's details. The desk, cluttered with papers. The open window, its latch slightly bent. The overturned chair, now righted by the police. She paused at the desk, noting a small ink stain on the blotter and a crumpled letter half hidden beneath a book. "Constable," she said, her voice mild, "might I examine this letter? I shan't touch it, of course." Reed, a young man eager to prove his worth, hesitated but nodded, lifting the letter with gloved hands. It was a single sheet, written in Evelyn's neat hand, addressed to "My dearest." The contents were brief. "I cannot go on like this. The weight of it is too much. I must tell someone, but I fear what will happen if I do." The letter was unsigned, and the ink was smudged, as if written in haste. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. "A cry for help, perhaps," she murmured. "Or a warning. To whom was it addressed, and why was it left here?" Reed, noting her interest, promised to pass the letter to Inspector Harrow. As they left the library, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the window. "Constable," she asked, "have you examined the ground outside? The dew was heavy this morning, yet I noticed some disturbance in the grass." Reed flushed, admitting the exterior had not yet been thoroughly checked. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "No matter, my dear boy. These things take time. But time, I fear, is something our murderer may be counting on." Back in the morning room, Miss Marple began her own quiet inquiries, speaking with each guest under the guise of offering comfort. To Lady Beatrice, she remarked on Evelyn's delicate
nothing more.
With Alvarez, Miss Marple adopted a different tack, commenting on the beauty of South American flora. "I hear some plants there are quite deadly," she said, her tone innocent. "Cyanide, for instance, can be derived from certain seeds, can it not?" Alvarez's smile was tight. "You are well informed, Miss Marple, but I am a businessman, not a botanist." To Leonard Baxter, she mentioned the pressures of legal work, eliciting a curt response about his busy schedule. Sylvia, however, seemed on the verge of tears, her hands twisting in her lap. "Evelyn was so kind. she whispered. "I can't believe anyone would hurt her." Miss Marple's mind worked swiftly, piecing together fragments of behavior and motive. The letter, the window, the vial, the alibis. Each was a clue, but none yet formed a complete picture. As the day wore on, Inspector Harrow announced that the police would remain at the manor, interviewing staff and searching for the poison's source. Miss Marple, however, knew that the truth lay not only in physical evidence, but in the hearts and minds of those around her. As she retired to her room that afternoon, she sat by the window, her knitting resumed. "Someone in this house is hiding a great deal," she thought. "And I suspect it is not just the murder of poor Evelyn. There is a larger game at play, and I must find its rules before another move is made." The clouds outside thickened, promising rain, and Miss Marple's needles clicked on, a quiet metronome to her thoughts, as she prepared to unravel the next thread in the mystery of Blackthorn Manor. Chapter 4. The Art of Asking Questions. The rain had begun to fall over Blackthorn Manor by mid-morning, a steady drizzle that draped the estate in a melancholy veil. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive, as the guests moved through the house like players in a somber tableau, each step shadowed by the knowledge of Evelyn Ashford's murder. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with a cup of tea and her ever-present knitting, observed the subtle shifts in behavior that the tragedy had wrought. Her delicate hands moved with precision, the needles clicking softly, but her mind was far busier, weaving together the threads of suspicion that had begun to emerge. Inspector Harrow and Constable Reed were methodical in their approach, questioning the staff and combing the manor for physical evidence. Yet Miss Marple knew that the key to unraveling the mystery lay not only in fingerprints or footprints, but in the contradictions of human nature. She had always believed that people, when pressed gently, revealed far more than they intended, and so she set about her own inquiries, her questions cloaked in the guise of an elderly spinster's curiosity. The other guests. "Jane," Lady Clara began, her voice trembling, "I can't shake the feeling that this horror is tied to Reginald's business dealings. He's been so secretive lately, ever since that Alvarez fellow arrived." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was alert. "Dear Clara, it is natural to seek patterns in such a tragedy, but tell me, what makes you think Sir Reginald's business is connected to poor Evelyn's death?" Lady Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting the lace of her handkerchief. "It's just... Evelyn was different these past weeks. She was always a quiet girl, but lately she seemed frightened. I overheard her arguing with Reginald in his study last week, something about dangerous people and promises broken. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now—" Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing briefly. "And Señor Alvarez? What do you know of him?" "Very little," Lady Clara admitted. "Reginald met him in Buenos Aires last year. He's involved in some timber trade, but I've heard whispers in the village, rumors of cartels, you know, men who deal in more than just wood." Miss Marple filed this away, her thoughts turning to Alvarez's polished demeanor and calculating gaze. "Thank you, Clara," she said gently. "You've been most helpful. Sometimes the smallest observation can light the way." Her next encounter was with Dr. Maurice Langley, whom she found in the library, ostensibly reviewing his medical notes, but clearly agitated. Miss Marple approached with her usual tact, commenting on the strain of his profession. "It must be difficult, Doctor, to maintain such composure in the face of tragedy," she said, her voice warm with sympathy. Langley adjusted his spectacles, his expression guarded, It's my duty, Miss Marple, but I confess, Evelyn's death has shaken me. I've known her since she was a child. You attended her often, I presume? Miss Marple asked, her tone innocent. She seemed delicate, yet her mother insists she was in good health. Langley hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Evelyn was sensitive, as Lady Beatrice says. She had occasional nervous complaints, but nothing serious. I prescribed a mild tonic last month, nothing more. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained. A tonic, you say? Stored in a vial, perhaps? Langley's hand twitched, spilling a drop of ink onto his notes. No, he said quickly. A bottle. Quite ordinary. I keep no cyanide in my kit, if that's what you're implying. Of course not, Miss Marple said, soothing. Possible origins. Her conversation with Captain Rutherford was less fruitful, his gruff manner and lingering hangover making him an uncooperative subject.
I was on the terrace, smoking, when I heard the cry,
he barked.
Didn't see a blasted thing. Why don't you lead this to the police, Miss Marple?
I find, Captain, she replied mildly, that a fresh perspective can sometimes uncover what others overlook. With Leonard and Sylvia Baxter, Miss Marple adopted a softer approach, joining them in the conservatory where Sylvia was arranging flowers, her hands trembling. Leonard stood nearby, his face a mask of tension.
Such a dreadful shock for you both,
Miss Marple said, her voice full of concern. You were close to Evelyn, were you not, Mrs. Baxter? Sylvia's eyes filled with tears.
She was like a sister to me, she whispered. We used to talk for hours when Leonard was working. She was worried about something, but she wouldn't say what.
Leonard cut in sharply.
Sylvia, that's enough. Miss Marple, my wife is upset. She doesn't know what she's saying.
Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but she noted the edge in Leonard's voice and the way Sylvia shrank back. Of course, Mr. Baxter, she said. Grief can cloud the mind, but sometimes it also sharpens memory. Her final conversation of the morning was with Señor Alvarez, whom she found in the billiard room, idly rolling a cue ball across the table. His smile was charming, but Miss Marple sensed the steel beneath it. Señor Alvarez, she began, you must find our English country houses quite different from those in Argentina. Tell me, what brings you to Blackthorn Manor?
Business, Miss Marple,
he replied smoothly.
Sir Reginald and I are exploring a venture in timber exports. He's a man of vision, though perhaps too trusting.
Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Trust can be a dangerous thing, can it not? Especially when large sums of money are involved. Alvarez's smile faltered for a fraction of a second.
Money is always a risk,
he said.
But I assure you my intentions are honorable.
As she left the billiard room, Miss Marple's mind was abuzz. The letter found in the library, Evelyn's argument with her father, the rumors of cartels, the nervous alibis, each piece was a fragment of a larger puzzle. She returned to the library under Constable Reed's supervision, her eyes drawn to the desk once more. Among the papers, she noticed a small appointment book, half buried under a stack of letters. With Reed's permission, she opened it, finding a cryptic entry for the previous week.
Meet L at 8 p.m. Must tell him.
In the secrets of Blackthorn Manor's inhabitants. She resolved to watch and listen, knowing that the murderer, confident in their cleverness, would soon make a mistake. And when they did, Miss Marple would be ready. Chapter 5. The red herrings emerge. The rain had settled into a persistent patter against the windows of Blackthorn Manor, casting a gray pallor over the house and its inhabitants. The air inside was thick with tension, as if the very walls held their breath, waiting for the next revelation in the tragedy of Evelyn Ashford's death. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, observed the guests with her usual quiet acuity, her sharp blue eyes catching the flickers of unease that passed between them. The click of her needles was a steady rhythm, grounding her thoughts as she sifted through the growing tangle of clues and contradictions. Inspector Harrow, with his brisk efficiency, had taken charge of the investigation, and by noon he had declared his initial theory. "It's clear to me," he announced to the assembled guests in the drawing room, "that Miss Ashford's death was no accident. The cyanide was deliberately administered, likely by someone in this house, and I have reason to suspect Captain Rutherford." A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Captain Rutherford, his face reddening, leapt to his feet. "That's preposterous," he bellowed, his voice thick with indignation. "I barely spoke to the girl. Why would I poison her?" Harrow held up a hand, his mustache twitching with authority. "You were seen on the terrace near the library window shortly before the cry was heard, Captain. And we've learned from the staff that you had a heated exchange with Miss Ashford 2 days ago, something about meddling in matters that don't concern her. Care to explain?" Rutherford's bluster faltered, his eyes darting to the other guests. "It was nothing," he muttered. "She overheard me talking about private matters. I told her to mind her own business. That's all." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze resting on Rutherford's flushed face. Private matters, she thought, a convenient phrase, but what lies beneath it? She noted the way Lady Beatrice's hands tightened in her lap and the fleeting glance Sylvia Baxter cast toward her husband Leonard. The captain's obvious discomfort made him a tempting suspect, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust the surface of things. In her experience, the most apparent culprit was often the least guilty. Harrow pressed on, detailing his evidence: a cigarette butt found near the library window, matching the brand Rutherford smoked, and his vague account of his movements between 9:30 and 10 o'clock. "You claim you were on the terrace for air?" Harrow said. Rutherford insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Ask Langley. He was with me." Dr. Langley adjusted his spectacles, his expression uneasy. "I can't be certain of the exact time," he said. "We were discussing naval tactics, but I stepped away briefly to fetch a book from the study." Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. How convenient, she thought, that alibis begin to fray at the edges. She made a mental note to revisit Langley's movements, recalling his earlier defensiveness about Evelyn's health. As Harrow continued his questioning, Miss Marple slipped away to the library, where Constable Reed was cataloging evidence. With his permission, she examined the desk once more, her eyes drawn to a small, overlooked detail: a torn corner of paper tucked beneath the blotter. It bore a single word in Evelyn's handwriting: cartel. Miss Marple's heart quickened. So Clara's suspicions were not unfounded, she thought. Evelyn knew something about her father's business, something dangerous. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found the guests dispersing, their faces a mixture of relief and suspicion at Rutherford's predicament. She approached Sylvia Baxter, who lingered near the fireplace, her eyes red-rimmed. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you seem troubled. Did Evelyn ever mention anything about her father's business ventures?" Sylvia hesitated, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. She hinted at things," she said softly. "Last week she told me she'd found papers in her father's study.
Something about shipments that weren't just timber. She was scared, Miss Marple. She said she didn't know who to trust.
Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. And did she mention anyone by name? Perhaps Mr. Alvarez? Sylvia's eyes widened, but before she could respond, Leonard appeared at her side, his expression stern. "Sylvia, you're overtired," he said, guiding her away. "Miss Marple, please don't upset my wife further." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her tone serene but her thoughts sharp. "Leonard is protective," she mused. "But is it love or fear that drives him?" Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Señor Alvarez, finding him in the conservatory, where he was examining a potted orchid with an air of detachment. "A beautiful plant," she remarked, her voice light. "I understand some tropical species can be quite dangerous. Cyanide, for instance, is derived from certain seeds, is it not?" Alvarez's smile was smooth, but his eyes were wary.
"You have a curious mind, Miss Marple," he said. "But I assure you, my interests lie in commerce, not chemistry."
And yet,
Before softening into a practiced charm, timber, as I've said, a lucrative trade but hardly sinister. Sir Reginald is an enthusiastic partner. Miss Marple smiled faintly, noting the careful phrasing. "Enthusiasm can blind one to risks," she said. "Evelyn, I suspect, saw something she wasn't meant to." As Alvarez excused himself, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the torn paper and Evelyn's cryptic letter. The word cartel suggested a connection to Alvarez's South American dealings, but the poison's source remained elusive. She recalled Dr. Langley's mention of a tonic and wondered if his medical supplies warranted closer scrutiny. That evening, as the guests gathered for a strained dinner, Inspector Harrow announced that the police had found a small bottle in the garden shed, hidden among gardening supplies. It bore traces of cyanide, though no fingerprints. The discovery cast further suspicion on Rutherford, who had been seen near the shed earlier in the week. Yet Miss Marple remained unconvinced. "The bottle is too convenient," she thought. "A distraction, perhaps, to divert attention from the true culprit." As the meal ended, Miss Marple noticed Lady Beatrice slip away to the study, her movements furtive. Following at a discreet distance, she overheard a whispered conversation through the cracked door. "We can't keep this up," Lady Beatrice said, her voice trembling. "If they find out what Evelyn knew?" The other voice, Leonard Baxter's, replied sharply, "Keep your nerve, Beatrice. No one suspects anything yet." Miss Marple retreated silently, her heart pounding. So, she thought, Lady Beatrice and Leonard share a secret. But is it murder or something else? The web of deceit was growing tighter, and Miss Marple knew that the next clue would bring her closer to the truth, or to danger. Chapter 6. A Clue in the Details. The rain had ceased by the following morning, leaving Blackthorn Manor shrouded in a damp mist that clung to the windows and softened the outlines of the estate's ancient oaks. Inside, the atmosphere was no less heavy, the guests moving through the house with the cautious tread of those who know they are being watched. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the library with her knitting, appeared as serene as ever, but her mind was a whirlwind of observation and deduction. The overheard conversation between Lady Beatrice and Leonard Baxter had added a new layer to the mystery, and the word cartel on the torn paper haunted her thoughts. Evelyn knew something, she mused, her needles clicking softly, and that knowledge cost her her life. Inspector Harrow's investigation had intensified, with constables combing the grounds and questioning the staff. The discovery of the cyanide bottle in the garden shed had solidified his focus on Captain Rutherford, whose blustering denials only deepened the inspector's suspicions. Yet Miss
understanding of human nature, sensed that the bottle was a plant, a red herring designed to mislead. The murderer is clever, she thought, but cleverness often betrays itself in the smallest details. Her opportunity to uncover such a detail came unexpectedly that morning, when she joined Lady Clara for a walk in the manor's rose garden. The air was fresh with the scent of wet earth, and Lady Clara, seeking distraction from her grief, spoke freely about the family. Evelyn was always so curious, she said, pausing to touch a drooping rose. She loved reading her father's business papers even as a girl. I used to think she'd make a fine secretary, but Reginald said it wasn't proper. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. Did she ever mention finding anything unusual in those papers? She asked, her tone light. Lady Clara frowned, her memory stirred. Once, a few weeks ago, she came to me quite upset. She said she'd found a letter in Reginald's study written in Spanish. She could read a little from her school days, and she thought it mentioned contrabando. She asked me what it meant, and I told her it was smuggling. She went pale, Jane, as if she'd seen a ghost. Smuggling, Miss Marple repeated softly, her mind racing. And did she say who the letter was from? She didn't, Lady Clara replied, but it was around the time Alvarez started visiting more often. I assumed it was from him. This revelation sent Miss Marple's thoughts spiraling toward Señor Diego Alvarez. His polished exterior and vague answers about his business dealings took on a new significance. She resolved to examine his interactions more closely, but first, she needed to confirm another suspicion. Returning to the house, Miss Marple sought out the butler, Mr. Grayson, a stoic man whose years of service had made him a repository of the manor's secrets. She found him in the pantry, polishing silver with meticulous care. Mr. Grayson, she began, her voice warm, you must see so much in a house like this, things others overlook. Tell me, did Miss Evelyn often visit the library alone in the evenings? Grayson paused, his cloth stilling. She did, Miss Marple, he said, especially these last few weeks. She'd spend hours at the desk, reading or writing. I once saw her slip a paper into a book, as if hiding it. Miss Marple's heart quickened. Do you recall which book? A volume of poetry, I believe, Grayson replied. Tennyson, perhaps. It was on the top shelf near the window. Thanking him, Miss Marple made her way to the library, where Constable Reed was stationed. With his permission, she scanned the shelves. If I tell, what will happen to us all? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. L again, she thought. Leonard or Langley, or perhaps someone else entirely. The note was another piece of the puzzle, but its meaning remained elusive. Her next encounter was with Dr. Langley, whom she found in the conservatory examining a tray of medical instruments. Dr. Langley, she said, her tone gentle. I've been thinking about poor Evelyn's health. You mentioned a tonic, but was there anything else she might have taken? Something less conventional? Langley's face tightened, his spectacles glinting. I've told you, Miss Marple, my prescriptions were standard. If you're suggesting I supplied the cyanide, not at all, Miss Marple interrupted smoothly. But in a large household, medicines can sometimes be misplaced. Have you checked your bag recently? Langley hesitated, then opened his medical bag, revealing an array of bottles and vials. He rummaged through them, his expression growing alarmed. My cyanide solution, it's missing, he said, his voice low. I keep a small amount for experimental purposes, locked in my case. It was here last week. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was alight. "Stolen, perhaps?" she said, "or taken by someone who knew where to look?" Leaving Langley to his unease, Miss Marple sought out Sylvia Baxter, finding her alone in the drawing room, staring at a photograph of Evelyn. "Mrs. Baxter," Miss Marple said softly, "you mentioned Evelyn's fears. Did she ever speak of someone called Elle?" Sylvia's hands trembled, and she glanced toward the door. She said something once about Leonard being involved in something dangerous. I thought she was mistaken, but she was so certain. She said he'd been meeting someone in secret, late at night." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts turning to the overheard conversation between Leonard and Lady Beatrice. "Thank you, my dear," she said. "You've been very brave." As the day wore on, Miss Marple pieced together her observations. The note hidden in the book, the missing cyanide from Langley's bag, Evelyn's knowledge of smuggling, and the mysterious Elle. Each clue pointed to a web of deceit that extended beyond the manor's walls, possibly to Alvarez's South American connections. Yet the poison's administration remained a puzzle. How had it reached Evelyn, and why in the library? That evening, as the guests gathered for another tense meal, Miss Marple noticed a new detail, a faint ink stain on Leonard Baxter's cuff, identical to the one on the library blotter. A small thing, she thought, but counterpoint to the storm brewing within Blackthorn Manor. The truth, she knew, was drawing nearer, but so, too, was the danger. Chapter 7. The Web of Lies Unravels. The mist that cloaked Blackthorn Manor had thickened by the third day, wrapping the estate in a ghostly shroud that seemed to mirror the secrets festering within its walls. The guests, confined by Inspector Harrow's orders, moved through the house with a strained civility, their glances laced with suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing room with her knitting, observed the subtle cracks in their facades, her sharp mind weaving together the clues that had emerged. The note hidden in Tennyson's poetry, the missing cyanide from Dr. Langley's bag, the ink stain on Leonard Baxter's cuff, and the whispered fears of smuggling and cartels. Each fragment pointed to a deeper truth, one that Miss Marple was determined to uncover. The morning began with a new development. Inspector Harrow, his mustache bristling with determination, announced that a search of Captain Rutherford's room had yielded a damning piece of evidence. A scrap of paper with a crude sketch of the library window and a note in his handwriting. 10 o'clock. Be ready. Harrow brandished the paper before the assembled guests, his voice heavy with accusation. Captain Rutherford, this suggests you planned to be at the library at the time of Miss Ashford's death. Care to explain? Rutherford's face turned a mottled red, his fists clenching. That's nonsense, he roared. I wrote that note days ago, for a meeting with a friend in the village. It has nothing to do with Evelyn. A friend? Harrow pressed. Name them. Rutherford faltered, his bluster fading. It was a private matter. I don't see why I should have to explain myself to you. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes narrowing. A weak defense, she thought. But his panic feels genuine. If he is guilty, he is not the mastermind. She noted the way Lady Beatrice's gaze flickered toward Leonard Baxter, and how Alvarez's fingers tightened around his cigarette case. The room was a tinderbox of secrets, and Miss Marple sensed that a spark was imminent. Determined to probe further, she sought out Mrs. Violet Hargreaves, whose sharp tongue and sharper eyes made her a valuable, if unwitting, ally. They sat in the conservatory, surrounded by the humid scent of ferns. "Mrs. Hargreaves," Miss Marple began, her tone gentle, "you have a remarkable gift for observation. Have you noticed anything unusual about Mr. Baxter's behavior these past days?" Mrs. Hargreaves's eyes gleamed with relish, her mind returning to the overheard conversation between Leonard and Lady Beatrice. "And Señor Alvarez?" she asked. "He seems a man of many secrets." Mrs. Hargreaves leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I don't trust him, Jane. Those South American types always up to something. I saw him in the garden 2 nights ago near the shed where they found that bottle. He was talking to someone, but I couldn't see who." This revelation sent a ripple through Miss Marple's thoughts. The garden shed, the cyanide bottle, Alvarez's late-night movements, each piece suggested a connection to Evelyn's death, but the puzzle remained incomplete. She thanked Mrs. Hargreaves and made her way to the study, where she found Sir Reginald alone, staring at a portrait of Evelyn above the fireplace. "Sir Reginald," Miss Marple said softly, "I know this is a painful time, but may I ask about your business with Señor Alvarez? Evelyn seemed troubled by it, did she not?" Sir Reginald's face crumpled, his voice hoarse. "She was curious, too curious, perhaps. She found some letters in my desk, correspondence with Alvarez about our timber trade. She thought there was something wrong, but I assured her it was all above board." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "And was it, Sir Reginald? All above board?" He hesitated, his hands trembling. "There were complications. Alvarez's partners in Argentina are not the sort one crosses lightly, but I never thought it would come to this." Miss Marple filed this away, her thoughts turning to the word cartel in Evelyn's note. She excused herself and sought out the library, where Constable Reed allowed her to examine the desk once more. Among the papers, she found a ledger, its pages filled with figures that seemed innocuous, shipments of timber, costs, and dates. But one entry caught her eye, a payment to L.B. for consulting services, dated the week before Evelyn's death. "L.B.," Miss Marple murmured. "Leonard Baxter?" The ink stain on his cuff, his secretive behavior, and Sylvia's fear all pointed to his involvement, but the nature of that involvement remained unclear. That afternoon, Miss Marple joined Sylvia Baxter for tea in the morning room, sensing the young woman's fragility. "My dear," she said, her voice warm, "you seem burdened. Did Evelyn ever share her fears about her father's business?" Sylvia's hands shook, spilling a drop of tea. She told me she'd seen papers in the study," she whispered. "Letters from Alvarez's partners, mentioning shipments that weren't timber. She thought Leonard was involved, that he'd been paid to look the other way. I begged her not to confront him, but she wouldn't listen." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "And did she confront him?" Sylvia nodded, tears welling. "The night before she died, I saw them arguing in the hall. Leonard was furious, said she'd ruin everything." As Sylvia broke down, Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. Leonard's involvement with Alvarez, Evelyn's discovery, the cyanide, each piece was falling into place. But the motive for murder remained elusive. Was it to silence Evelyn, or to protect a larger scheme? That evening, as the guests gathered for another strained dinner, Miss Marple noticed a new tension. Lady Beatrice avoided Leonard's gaze, and Alvarez's usual charm seemed forced. She also observed Dr. Langley's nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles, as if hiding something. The truth is close, she thought, but the murderer is watching, waiting for a mistake. As the meal ended, Miss Marple slipped into the hall, her eyes catching a glint of metal under a side table. Bending down, she retrieved a small key, its shape suggesting it belonged to a lockbox or drawer. Another clue, she thought, tucking it into her pocket, and perhaps the key to unlocking this deadly puzzle. The mist outside began to lift, revealing the faint outline of the manor's gardens. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm, a quiet counterpoint to the storm of secrets brewing within Blackthorn Manor. She knew the next revelation would bring her closer to the truth, or to the murderer's desperate next move. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The fourth day at Blackthorn Manor dawned with a fragile clarity, the mist giving way to a pale sun that cast long shadows across the dew-soaked lawns. Inside, the weight of Evelyn Ashford's murder pressed heavier on the guests, their civility fraying like old silk. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, felt the undercurrents of fear and guilt swirling around her. The small key she had found beneath the hall table rested in her pocket, a tangible link to the secrets she was unraveling. Her mind, ever meticulous, turned over the clues. The note hidden in Tennyson's poetry, the ledger entry for L.B., the missing cyanide from Dr. Langley's bag, and Sylvia Baxter's tearful confession about Evelyn's confrontation with Leonard. Each piece pointed to a conspiracy that extended beyond the manor's walls, but the heart of the mystery lay in the human passions that drove it. The morning brought a new development, one that cracked the fragile composure of the household. Inspector Harrow, his face grim, gathered the guests in the drawing room to announce the results of a deeper search. "We've found a hidden compartment in the library desk," he said, holding up a small, leather-bound notebook. "It contains coded entries, likely related to Sir Reginald's business dealings. Miss Ashford appears to have been deciphering did Sir Reginald, and someone wanted her silenced. We're sending the notebook to a cryptographer, but I'd like to know who else had access to that desk." The room erupted in uneasy murmurs. Leonard Baxter's face paled, and Lady Beatrice's hand trembled as she reached for her tea. Miss Marple, observing from her corner, noted the way Alvarez's fingers tightened around his cigarette case, a telltale sign of nerves. The notebook, she thought, is the key to Evelyn's fears, and someone here knows its contents. As Harrow continued his questioning, Miss Marple slipped away to the library where Constable Reed allowed her to examine the desk's hidden compartment. It was cleverly concealed behind a false panel requiring a small key to unlock. She produced the key from her pocket, and to Reed's astonishment, it fit perfectly, revealing a shallow space, now empty, save for a faint trace of ink. "So," Miss Marple murmured, "Evelyn found this compartment, and someone ensured she'd never reveal what was inside." Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Sylvia Baxter alone, her face drawn with exhaustion. Sensing a moment of vulnerability, she sat beside her, her voice gentle. "My dear, you've carried a heavy burden. Evelyn trusted you, didn't she? What else did she tell you about those papers?" Sylvia's eyes filled with tears, and her voice broke as she spoke. "She was terrified, Miss Marple. She said she'd found proof that her father's business wasn't just timber, that there were shipments of something else hidden in the crates. She thought Leonard was helping cover it up, taking money to keep quiet. She wanted to tell the police, but I begged her not to. I was so afraid for her, and for us." Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. "And did she say who else was involved?" Sylvia shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "She mentioned a name, Diego. She said he was dangerous, that he'd do anything to protect his interests. Oh, Miss Marple, I should have helped her, but I was too scared." Sylvia's sobs drew the attention of Lady Clara, who hurried over, her face etched with concern. As she comforted Sylvia, Miss Marple withdrew, her thoughts turning to Alvarez. His connection to the cartel Evelyn had written about was becoming clearer, but the method of her murder, cyanide, swift and silent, suggested a more personal betrayal. That afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Dr. Langley, finding him in the conservatory, his hands busy with a tray of instruments. "Dr. Langley," she said, her tone mild, "I've been thinking about your missing cyanide. It's curious, isn't it, that such a dangerous substance could vanish from a locked bag. Langley's face tightened, his spectacles glinting. "I've told you, Miss Marple, it was stolen. I keep my bag secure, but someone must have—"
But who in this house would know how to access it? Someone familiar with your habits, perhaps?
Langley's hands trembled, and he turned away, muttering about his duties. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind noting his unease. He knows more than he admits, she thought. But is it guilt or fear of being implicated? Her next encounter was with Leonard Baxter, whom she found in the study, poring over a stack of papers. His face was pale, and the ink stain on his cuff was still visible, a silent accusation. "Mr. Baxter," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, "you seem troubled. Is it the loss of Evelyn or something else?" Leonard's eyes darted to the door as if expecting an interruption. "I don't know what you mean," he said curtly. "This is a tragic time for us all." "Of course," Miss Marple replied. "But Evelyn's curiosity about her father's business must have been inconvenient for some. Did she ever confront you about it?" Leonard's jaw tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might confess. But he stood abruptly, his voice sharp. "You're meddling in things you don't understand, Miss Marple. Leave it to the police." As he stormed out, Miss Marple's gaze fell on the papers he'd left behind. Among them was a letter written in Spanish with the word contrabando underlined. Her knowledge of the language was limited, but she recognized the handwriting as Alvarez's. So, she thought, Evelyn was right. But how did the cyanide reach her? That evening, as the guests gathered for dinner, the tension was palpable. Sylvia's outburst had spread like wildfire, and whispers of smuggling and cartels circulated among the guests. Lady Beatrice, her composure crumbling, excused herself early, claiming a headache. Alvarez, usually suave, seemed distracted, his eyes following Leonard with a predatory intensity. Captain Rutherford, still under suspicion, drank heavily, his protests of innocence growing louder. Miss Marple, watching it all, felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting into place. Sylvia's confession had cracked the facade, revealing the fear that bound the household. The notebook, the key, the letter, all pointed to a conspiracy that Evelyn had stumbled upon, and someone had killed to protect it. But the final piece, the method of the poison's delivery, remained elusive. As she retired to her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting idle in her lap. The pale moon illuminated the gardens, and she thought of Evelyn alone in the library, her life snuffed out by a betrayal she hadn't foreseen. "The truth is near," Miss Marple murmured, "but the murderer is desperate, and desperation breeds—" Chapter 9. The Trap is Set. The 5th day at Blackthorn Manor brought a deceptive calm, as if the house itself were holding its breath before the inevitable storm. The pale sunlight filtering through the windows did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that hung over the guests. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the morning room with her knitting, sensed the tension reaching a breaking point. Sylvia Baxter's tearful confession, the coded notebook, the Spanish letter, and the small key in her pocket had woven a tapestry of clues, each thread pointing to a conspiracy that had cost Evelyn Ashford her life. Yet the final piece, how the cyanide had reached her, remained tantalizingly out of reach. Miss Marple knew that to catch a murderer, she must apply pressure, forcing them to reveal themselves through a misstep. Inspector Harrow, growing frustrated with the lack of progress, had doubled his efforts, questioning the staff and re-examining the library. His focus remained on Captain Rutherford, whose vague alibis, and the damning note in his room kept him in the spotlight. Yet Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, suspected that Rutherford was a distraction, a convenient scapegoat for a more cunning mind. The murderer is clever, she thought, her needles clicking softly. But cleverness often overreaches. Her plan to set a trap began to form during a quiet conversation with Lady Clara, who sought her out in the conservatory, her face etched with worry. "Jane," she said, her voice low, "the police are no closer to the truth, and I fear for Reginald. He's not himself. Those business dealings with Alvarez have him terrified. What if he's next?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. "Dear Clara, fear can cloud judgment, but it can also reveal truth. Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual in the household routines? Perhaps something about the staff or the delivery of meals?" Lady Clara frowned, considering. "Well, there was one thing. The evening Evelyn died, I saw Grayson, the butler, carrying a tray to the library. I thought it odd, as Evelyn hadn't requested anything. He said she'd asked for a glass of water, but she was so particular about her drinks. She always preferred lemonade." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "A glass of water," she murmured. "And where is that glass now?" Lady Clara shook her head. "I don't know. The police didn't mention finding one." This revelation sent Miss Marple's thoughts racing. The cyanide, she knew, was fast-acting, requiring ingestion moments before death. A glass of water, delivered to the library, could have been the perfect vehicle. She thanked Lady Clara and made her way to the kitchen. "Evenings?" Grayson's hands stilled, his face impassive. "Occasionally, Miss Marple." That night she asked for a glass of water. I left it on the desk around 9:45 and returned to my duties. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "And did you see anyone else near the library at that time?" Grayson hesitated, a flicker of unease crossing his face. I saw Mr. Baxter in the hall heading toward the study. He seemed in a hurry." Thanking him, Miss Marple filed this away, her suspicions about Leonard Baxter deepening. The ink stain on his cuff, his argument with Evelyn, and now his presence near the library, all pointed to his involvement. But she needed more than suspicion. She needed proof. To set her trap, Miss Marple approached Inspector Harrow with a carefully worded suggestion. "Inspector," she said, her voice mild, "I've been thinking about the notebook you found. If it contains secrets worth killing for, perhaps we should let it be known that it's been decoded. The murderer, believing their scheme is exposed, may act rashly." Harrow raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. "You think we can flush them out, Miss Marple?" "I believe," she replied, "that a guilty conscience is a restless one. Announce at dinner that the cryptographer has uncovered evidence of a smuggling ring, and watch how the guests react." Harrow agreed, and that evening, as the guests gathered for a tense dinner, he made his announcement. "We've had a breakthrough," he said, his voice carrying over the clink of cutlery. "The notebook's code has been broken. It details a smuggling operation linked to Sir Reginald's business, with names and dates. We'll be making arrests soon." The effect was immediate. Sir Reginald's fork clattered to his plate, his face pale. Lady Beatrice's hand froze midair, her eyes darting to Leonard Baxter. Alvarez's smile vanished, replaced by a cold intensity. Leonard himself grew rigid, his knuckles white around his glass, while Sylvia let out a small gasp, quickly stifled. Captain Rutherford, still under suspicion, muttered a curse, and Dr. Langley adjusted his spectacles nervously. Miss Marple watched it all, her needles idle in her lap. The trap is set, she thought. Now, who will take the bait? After dinner, she lingered in the drawing room, her eyes on Leonard Baxter, who excused himself to fetch a book from the study. Following at a discreet distance, she saw him slip into the library instead, his movements furtive. She signaled to Constable Reed, who was stationed nearby, and together they approached the library door. Through the crack, they saw Leonard rifling through the desk, his hands trembling as he searched for something. Froze, his face a mask of panic.
I was just checking some papers, he stammered. This is none of your business, Miss Marple.
Oh, but it is,
she replied, her eyes twinkling. You see, Evelyn found something in this desk, proof of your involvement in a smuggling scheme, perhaps. A scheme that Señor Alvarez orchestrated with your help as Sir Reginald's solicitor? Leonard's eyes widened and he took a step back, his hands shaking. You're wrong, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I had nothing to do with her death. Before Miss Marple could press further, a shadow moved at the window, and a loud crash echoed from the garden. Reed rushed outside, and Miss Marple followed, her heart pounding. In the moonlight, they found a broken flower pot and footprints leading toward the shed. Someone was listening, Miss Marple said, her voice low. And they're desperate to cover their tracks. As Reed called for backup, Miss Marple returned to the library, her mind racing. Leonard's panic, the footprints, the missing glass of water, all pointed to a conspiracy that was unraveling. The trap had worked, but the murderer was still at large, and Miss Marple knew the next move would be critical. The sun had set, and the shadows of Blackthorn Manor grew darker, hiding a killer who was running out of time. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The night air around Blackthorn Manor was thick with tension, the moon casting a pale glow over the gardens where the broken flower pot and fresh footprints marked the murderer's desperate flight. Inside, the library was a scene of controlled chaos, with Constable Reed organizing a search of the grounds and Inspector Harrow questioning Leonard Baxter, whose panic had betrayed him. Miss Jane Marple stood quietly by the desk, her knitting abandoned, her sharp blue eyes taking in every detail. The trap she had set with Harrow's announcement had worked, flushing out a reaction, but the final pieces of the puzzle were only now falling into place. The time had come to gather the guests and reveal the truth behind Evelyn Ashford's murder. Inspector Harrow, sensing the urgency, agreed to Miss Marple's request to assemble everyone in the drawing room. The guests filed in, their faces a mix of fear, suspicion, and exhaustion. Sir Reginald sat heavily, his eyes hollow with grief. Lady Beatrice clutched her shawl, her composure brittle. Dr. Langley adjusted his spectacles nervously, while Captain Rutherford, still under suspicion, glowered from a corner. Señor Diego Alvarez maintained his polished facade, though his cigarette trembled slightly. Leonard and Sylvia Baxter sat apart, her eyes red-rimmed, his face taut with dread. Mrs. Violet Hargreaves, ever eager for drama, leaned forward, her sharp eyes darting between the others. Lady Clara, pale but resolute, stood by Miss Marple.
Observations. We've uncovered new evidence. The notebook's code, while not fully deciphered, points to a smuggling operation tied to Sir Reginald's business. But it's the events of this evening, Mr. Baxter's actions and the disturbance outside, that have brought us closer to the truth. Miss Marple stepped forward, her small figure commanding the room's attention. My friends, she said, her voice calm but firm, Evelyn Ashford's death was no accident, nor was it the work of a stranger. It was a carefully planned murder, driven by fear and greed. Allow me to explain, step by step, how it came to pass. She began with the timeline. Evelyn died between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, poisoned by cyanide delivered in a glass of water brought by Mr. Grayson, the butler, at her request. But the cyanide was not in the water when he left it. Someone added it afterward. Someone who knew Evelyn would drink it. Her eyes swept the room, noting Leonard's tense posture. Evelyn was a curious young woman, too curious for her own good. She discovered papers in her father's study, letters in Spanish, mentioning contrabando, or smuggling. These papers implicated Señor Alvarez and his South American partners in a scheme to hide illicit goods in timber shipments. But they also revealed another name, L.B. Leonard Baxter. Leonard started, his face paling. "That's absurd," he protested. "I'm a solicitor, not a criminal." Miss Marple's gaze was unyielding. "You were paid, Mr. Baxter, to falsify documents and ensure the shipments passed inspection. The ledger entry for L.B. confirms it. Evelyn confronted you, didn't she? The night before her death in the hall, as Sylvia witnessed. You feared she would expose you, ruining your career and your marriage." Sylvia gasped, her hands covering her mouth. Leonard's eyes darted to the door, but Constable Reed stood ready. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "But you did not act alone. The cyanide came from Dr. Langley's medical bag, stolen by someone who knew his habits. And the glass of water was tampered with by someone with access to the library at the critical moment." Her gaze shifted to Lady Beatrice, who flinched. "Lady Beatrice, you knew of your husband's dealings with Alvarez. Evelyn told you of her fears, didn't she? You overheard her argument with Sir Reginald about dangerous people. But instead of protecting her, you saw an opportunity." Lady Beatrice's composure cracked, her voice trembling. I only wanted to protect Reginald. He was in too deep with Alvarez. Evelyn's meddling would have destroyed us." Miss Marple nodded, her expression somber. "You took the cyanide from Dr. Langley's bag, knowing his carelessness with the lock. You suggest an outsider." But the ink stain on Leonard's cuff, matching the library blotter, placed him at the desk, where he helped you cover your tracks. Leonard leapt to his feet, his voice hoarse. "She's lying. I didn't kill Evelyn." "No," Miss Marple said softly, "but you knew what Lady Beatrice had done. You were in the library searching for the notebook to destroy it when you heard her cry. You fled through the window, leaving the footprints we found tonight." Alvarez, silent until now, stood, his face cold. "This is nonsense, Miss Marple. You have no proof." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, but I do, Señor Alvarez. The letter in Spanish, with your handwriting, was found among Evelyn's papers. It mentioned contrabando, and your instructions to Leonard. You orchestrated the smuggling, but when Evelyn threatened to expose it, you relied on Lady Beatrice's desperation to silence her." Harrow stepped forward, his notebook open. "We've sent the letter for verification, but the footprints outside match Mr. Baxter's shoes, and the key Miss Marple found unlocks the desk's hidden compartment. Lady Beatrice, Mr. Baxter, you're under arrest." Lady Beatrice collapsed into a chair, sobbing, while Leonard stood frozen, his defiance crumbling. Alvarez's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his eyes burning with suppressed rage. The other guests sat in stunned silence, the weight of the truth settling over them. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her knitting resumed. "It is a sad thing," she said quietly, "when greed and fear overcome love. Evelyn sought only to protect her family, but in doing so, she uncovered a truth too dangerous to bear." As Harrow and Reed led Lady Beatrice and Leonard away, the drawing-room fell silent, save for the soft click of Miss Marple's needles
The puzzle was solved, but the cost was heavy, and the shadows of Blackthorn Manor seemed darker for it. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The morning after the dramatic reveal in Blackthorn Manor's drawing room was one of quiet aftermath, as if the house itself exhaled after days of holding its breath. The sun broke through the clouds, casting a tentative light across the dew-laden gardens, but the warmth did little to dispel the chill of betrayal that lingered within the manor's walls. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, her knitting resting lightly in her lap, her sharp blue eyes softened by a contemplative air. The arrests of Lady Beatrice and Leonard Baxter had closed the chapter on Evelyn Ashford's murder, yet the echoes of the tragedy reverberated through the household, leaving its inhabitants to grapple with.
Sister took charge of the household, her practicality a bulwark against the chaos. Dr. Maurice Langley, shaken by the theft of his cyanide, busied himself with packing, his usual composure frayed. Captain Hugh Rutherford, exonerated but humiliated by his time under suspicion, muttered apologies to anyone who would listen. Mrs. Violet Hargreaves, her appetite for gossip sated, spoke in hushed tones, her usual sharpness tempered by the gravity of the events. Sylvia Baxter, devastated by her husband's complicity, remained in her room, tended by a solicitous maid. Señor Diego Alvarez, his charm now a hollow mask, prepared to depart, his role in the smuggling scheme under scrutiny by Inspector Harrow's superiors. Miss Marple, as was her custom, sought no accolades for her role in unraveling the mystery. She preferred the quiet satisfaction of truth restored, though she felt a pang for the broken lives left in its wake. Lady Clara found her in the morning room, a tray of tea in hand, and sat beside her, her face etched with gratitude and sorrow. "Jane," she said, her voice soft, "you've saved us from a greater tragedy, but I can't help feeling we've lost so much. How did you see what we all missed?" Miss Marple's needles clicked gently, a soothing rhythm. "My dear Clara," she replied, "I am no more clever than anyone else. I simply observe. People are like skeins of wool, tangled, knotted, but with a pattern if you look closely. Evelyn's death was a knot, tied by fear and greed, but it was her own courage that began to unravel it." Lady Clara's eyes glistened. "She was so young, so determined. If only she'd come to me instead of confronting them." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but firm. "Youth often sees truth where age grows cautious. Evelyn saw the danger in her father's business, the shadow of the cartel behind Señor Alvarez's polished words. She trusted her heart, but she underestimated the desperation of those she threatened." Lady Clara hesitated, then asked, "And Beatrice? How could she, her own daughter?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the garden stretched toward the horizon. "Love can twist into fear, Clara, when it is bound to ambition. Lady Beatrice believed she was protecting Sir Reginald, shielding their life from ruin. But, in her panic, she betrayed the very thing she sought to preserve. It is a sad truth, but not an uncommon one." Their conversation was interrupted by Inspector Harrow, who entered with a respectful nod. "Miss Marple," he said, his mustache twitching with a hint of admiration, "I owe you an apology. I thought too much credit, Inspector. I merely pointed out what was already there. You and your men did the rest." Harrow shook his head, a rare smile breaking through. "You're a marvel, Miss Marple. If ever you tire of St. Mary Mead, Scotland Yard could use you." She laughed softly, a sound like the tinkling of a bell. Oh, Inspector, I am far too fond of my garden and my knitting for that. Besides, the mysteries of a village are quite enough for me. As Harrow left to oversee the final arrangements, Miss Marple turned her thoughts to the broader implications of the case. The smuggling scheme, with its ties to a ruthless South American cartel, was a dark undercurrent that had swept Evelyn into its depths. Leonard Baxter's greed had made him a willing pawn, and Lady Beatrice's fear had driven her to murder. Yet Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a quiet resolve to remember the human cost of such schemes. That afternoon, she took a final walk through the gardens, pausing by the library window where the footprints had been found. The grass was still disturbed, a silent testament to Leonard's flight and Lady Beatrice's desperation. The world is full of such shadows, she thought, but light comes from seeing them clearly. As she prepared to depart Blackthorn Manor, Miss Marple gathered her things, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag. Lady Clara escorted her to the door, her gratitude evident. "You'll come back, won't you, Jane? When this is all behind us." "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling. "There is always a place for tea and conversation, even after the darkest storms." With a final nod, she stepped into the waiting car, the manor receding behind her as the driver navigated the winding road to St. Mary Mead. The case was closed, the truth revealed, but Miss Marple knew that the ripples of Evelyn's death would linger. As the countryside rolled by, she reflected on the fragility of trust and the power of observation. "The little gray cells," she murmured, a faint smile on her lips. "They are never idle when there is truth to be found." Chapter 12. The Echoes of Truth. The departure of Miss Jane Marple from Blackthorn Manor left a quiet void, as if the house itself mourned the clarity she had brought to its shadowed halls. The sun, now high in the sky, bathed the estate in a golden light, but the warmth could not erase the chill of betrayal that lingered among its inhabitants. Sir Reginald Ashford, broken by his wife's treachery and his daughter's death, had retreated into a near-silent solitude, his once boisterous presence reduced to a ghostly figure haunting the manor's corridors. Lady Clara, ever resilient, took charge of unresolved questions. Senor Diego Alvarez, under intense scrutiny from Inspector Harrow, had been detained for further questioning in London. His suave demeanor no match for the mounting evidence of his cartel connections. Back in the tranquil haven of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm as she worked on a delicate lace shawl. The soft hum of village life, children laughing in the lane, the distant chime of the church bell, offered a soothing contrast to the turmoil of Blackthorn Manor. Yet her mind, ever active, returned to the case, sifting through the details to ensure no thread remained loose. The arrests of Lady Beatrice and Leonard Baxter had resolved the question of Evelyn's murder, but Miss Marple knew that the broader web of deceit woven by Alvarez's cartel extended far beyond the manor's walls. She felt a quiet duty to reflect on the case, to ensure that every clue had been accounted for. A letter from Inspector Harrow arrived that afternoon, written in his precise, official hand. "Miss Marple," it read, "your insights were invaluable. The notebook's code has been fully deciphered, revealing payments to Leonard Baxter and instructions from Alvarez for smuggling narcotics within timber shipments.
Lady Beatrice has confessed to the murder, driven by fear that Evelyn's discoveries would ruin Sir Reginald and expose them to the cartel's wrath. Baxter admits to his role in the scheme, but denies direct involvement in the murder. Alvarez faces charges, though his connections may complicate prosecution. Your observations, the ink stain, the key, the hidden note, were the keys to unlocking this case. Scotland Yard owes you a debt. Miss Marple set the letter aside, her thoughts drifting to Evelyn's courage and its tragic cost. The young woman's curiosity had uncovered a dangerous truth, but her trust in those closest to her had led to her downfall. So like the girls in the village, Miss Marple mused, recalling the impulsive bravery of her neighbor's niece, who once climbed a tree to rescue a kitten and nearly fell. Evelyn climbed too high, and the branch broke beneath her. Her reverie was interrupted by a visit from Sylvia Baxter, who arrived unannounced, her pale face marked by a fragile determination. Miss Marple welcomed her warmly, offering tea and a seat by the fire. "Mrs. Baxter," she said, her voice gentle, "you've come along good. Your honesty helped bring the truth to light." Sylvia's eyes glistened. "But what do I do now? I can't go back to London, not with everyone knowing what Leonard did. I want to start over, somewhere quiet, but I'm afraid." Miss Marple nodded, her voice firm but kind.
"Fear is natural, but you are stronger than you know. A village like this one can be a place to heal, to find new roots. People will talk, but their words fade, and a good heart endures."
As Sylvia left, promising to write, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her thoughts returning to the manor. The small details, the torn paper with "Cartel," the ink stain on Leonard's cuff, the hidden key, had been the threads that unraveled the mystery. But it was Evelyn's diary, found after Miss Marple's departure, that had sealed the case, its entries confirming the smuggling scheme and Leonard's complicity.
"The little gray cells,"
she murmured.
"They see what the heart sometimes misses."
That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Miss Marple took a walk through her garden, pausing to admire the late roses. The case of Blackthorn Manor had been a dark one, a reminder that even in the grandest houses, human nature could twist into betrayal. Yet it was also a testament to the power of observation, of seeing the patterns beneath the surface. As she returned to her cottage, the church bell chimed, and Miss Marple smiled faintly, content in the knowledge that for now the truth had prevailed, and the quiet of St. Mary Mead could embrace her once more. Chapter 13. The Unraveling Threads. The days following Miss Jane Marple's departure from Blackthorn Manor were marked by a somber stillness, as if the estate were coming to terms with the truths she had uncovered. The golden sunlight that had briefly warmed the gardens gave way to a soft autumnal haze, casting long shadows that seemed to echo the lingering doubts among the remaining guests. Sir Reginald Ashford, broken by his wife's betrayal and his daughter's death, had retreated into a near-silent solitude, his once boisterous presence reduced to a ghostly figure haunting the manor's corridors. Lady Clara, ever resilient, took on the burden of maintaining order while the other guests, Dr. Maurice Langley, Captain Hugh Rutherford, Mrs. Violet Hargreaves, and Sylvia Baxter, prepared to leave, each carrying their own burdens of guilt, relief, or unresolved questions. Señor Diego Alvarez, under intense scrutiny from Inspector Harrow, had been detained for further questioning in London, his suave demeanor no match for the mounting evidence of his cartel connections. Miss Marple, now back in the familiar comfort of her cottage in St. Mary Mead, sat by her window with a cup of tea, her knitting resting lightly in her lap. Mind, ever active, returned to the case, sifting through the details to ensure no thread remained loose. The arrests of Lady Beatrice and Leonard Baxter had resolved the question of Evelyn's murder, but Miss Marple knew that the broader web of deceit, woven by Alvarez's cartel, extended far beyond the manor's walls. She felt a quiet duty to tie up the final strands, if only for her own satisfaction. Her thoughts were interrupted by a letter from Lady Clara, delivered that morning by the village postman. It was written in Clara's neat, deliberate hand, filled with gratitude but tinged with unease. "Dear Jane," it read, "your presence here was a godsend, but I fear the shadows of this affair will linger. The police have taken Alvarez to London, and they've found more papers in Reginald's study, letters and ledgers that confirm the smuggling operation. But there's something else, something Evelyn left behind. I found a diary in her room, locked in a drawer. I haven't opened it, but I feel it may hold answers we've yet to uncover. Could you return, just once more, to help us lay this to rest?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. A diary, hidden and locked, suggested Evelyn had been more cautious than anyone realized. She penned a brief reply, promising to visit the following day, and resumed her knitting, her mind already turning over the possibilities. Evelyn was no fool, she thought. She knew the danger she faced, and she left a record. But what secrets did she guard so closely? The next morning, Miss Marple arrived at Blackthorn Manor, greeted by a weary but grateful Lady Clara. The house felt emptier, with most of the guests gone, and the staff reduced to a skeleton crew. Sir Reginald remained in his study, unwilling to face visitors, but Clara led Miss Marple to Evelyn's room, a small, airy chamber overlooking the rose garden. The diary, bound in soft blue leather, lay on a table, its lock undone by a key Clara had found in Evelyn's jewelry box. Miss Marple opened the diary with care, her fingers tracing the pages filled with Evelyn's precise handwriting. The entries began innocently, notes about the weather, books she'd read, and her father's growing preoccupation with his business. But as Miss Marple turned the pages, the tone shifted to one of mounting fear. An entry dated 2 weeks before her death read, "Found another letter in father's desk, hidden in a false bottom. It's from D.A., instructions to L.B., about a shipment arriving next month. Not timber, something illegal. I confronted father, but he says it's just business. I don't believe him. L.B. knows, and I think mother suspects. I'm scared." Another entry, written the night before her death, was more urgent. "L.B. was furious when I spoke to him. He said I'd ruin everything if I told anyone. I saw mother watching us. She looked terrified. I've hidden the letter in the library, in Tennyson. If anything happens to me, someone must find it." Miss Marple closed the diary, her heart heavy. "Poor child," she murmured. "She saw the truth, but trusted the wrong people." The diary confirmed what she had suspected. Evelyn's murder was not just about silencing her, but protecting a larger scheme. Lady Beatrice had acted out of fear for her husband's safety, and Leonard Baxter had been complicit to save his own skin. But Alvarez, the mastermind, remained a looming threat. She shared her findings with Lady Clara, who listened with a mix of sorrow and resolve. "What do we do now, Jane?" she asked. "Reginald is broken, and the police say Alvarez may escape prosecution if they can't link him directly to the murder." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet determination. "The law will have its way, Clara, but we must ensure justice for Evelyn. Send the diary to Inspector Harrow. It corroborates the letter and the notebook. Alvarez's partners may be ruthless, but they cannot hide from the truth forever." As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple took a final walk through the manor's gardens, pausing by the library window where Evelyn's fate had been sealed. The grass had begun to recover,
but the memory of the footprints lingered in her mind. The world is full of such schemes, she thought, but they unravel when one person dares to seek the truth. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple settled into her routine, her knitting needles clicking as she reflected on the case. The diary had been the final thread tying together the motives and betrayals that had led to Evelyn's death. Yet she knew that Alvarez's cartel, like a hydra, would likely sprout new heads elsewhere. Still, she murmured, one head is gone, and that is something. The village church bell chimed, and Miss Marple smiled faintly, her thoughts turning to her garden and the simple pleasures of home. The mystery of Blackthorn Manor was solved, but the lessons it taught of courage, betrayal, and the quiet power of observation would remain with her always. Chapter 14. The Final Knots. The quiet of St. Mary Mead enveloped Miss Jane Marple as she sat in her cottage, the familiar hum of village life a gentle counterpoint to the storm of secrets she had unraveled at Blackthorn Manor. The diary of Evelyn Ashford, now in the hands of Inspector Harrow, had provided the final thread to tie the case together. But Miss Marple's mind lingered on the broader implications of the smuggling cartel and the lives it had shattered. The soft click of her knitting needles as she worked on a delicate lace shawl kept time with her thoughts, each stitch a reminder that even the most intricate patterns could be understood with patience and care. A letter arrived that had begun to unravel the full scope of their actions. Lady Beatrice, broken by guilt, had admitted to slipping the cyanide into Evelyn's glass of water, driven by a desperate fear that her daughter's revelations would destroy Sir Reginald's reputation and expose them to the wrath of Alvarez's cartel. Leonard, meanwhile, had confessed to his role as a paid intermediary, falsifying documents to conceal the smuggling of contraband, likely narcotics, hidden within the timber shipments. The diary's entries, combined with the coded notebook and the Spanish letter, had also provided enough evidence to detain Señor Diego Alvarez, who was now facing charges of conspiracy and fraud in London, with international authorities investigating his cartel connections. Yet Miss Marple knew that justice, while served, could not erase the tragedy. Evelyn's courage had exposed a dangerous truth, but it had cost her life, and the Ashford family would bear the scars forever. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate balance of human nature, the capacity for love twisted into betrayal, and the quiet strength of those who seek truth despite the cost. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. To her surprise, it was Sylvia Baxter, pale and fragile but with a newfound resolve in her eyes. Miss Marple welcomed her warmly, offering a seat by the fire and a cup of tea. "Mrs. Baxter," she said, her voice gentle, "I did not expect to see you so soon. How are you faring?" Sylvia's hands trembled as she held the cup, but her voice was steady. "I had to come, Miss Marple. I needed to thank you and to ask for your advice. Leonard's confession, it's broken me, but it's also freed me. I can't stay in London, not with the memories. I'm thinking of starting anew, perhaps in a village like this, but I'm afraid of what people will think, knowing what my husband did." Miss Marple's eyes softened, her needles pausing. "My dear, people will always talk, but their words fade with time. You are young, and you have strength you've yet to discover. A village like St. Mary Mead can be a place to heal, but you must first forgive yourself for what you could not prevent." Sylvia's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Evelyn trusted me, and I failed her. I should have spoken up sooner." "You spoke when it mattered," Miss Marple said firmly.
Your courage helped bring the truth to light. Evelyn would be proud of that. As Sylvia left, promising to write, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her thoughts drifting back to Blackthorn Manor. She recalled the small details that had led to the solution. The ink stain on Leonard's cuff, the hidden time to see them. That afternoon, she took a walk through her garden, pausing to admire the late roses that bloomed despite the encroaching autumn. The simplicity of St. Mary Mead was a balm after the darkness of the manor, but Miss Marple knew that even here, secrets could lurk beneath the surface. Her role, as always, was to watch and listen, to unravel the knots of human folly with the quiet precision of her little gray cells. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the village, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her heart lightened by the knowledge that justice had prevailed, if at a heavy cost. The case of Evelyn Ashford was closed, but its lessons of trust, betrayal, and the power of truth would linger, like the scent of roses in the evening air. Chapter 15. The Quiet After the Storm. The soft light of an
week full. No stop tearing speaking to the ankles faster than I mean, Sherman contain wet blood of lease with Mr. Ryan. I had long rest and Mr. to the internet show. Neil, I am going to end up and all is likely for saying out shit and all. Fanning was like, you go to the colonel. Sound the shit. Come on. The little for booking at Joel and then Joel. It's a pure plus file. Middle like resume for this kid over the we should see and just to regular go give us link all wrong. Not be down for kind of curse on just like for that thing maybe and look first please well look me long up like and on the door this is the fill that up now it could be hard taste has your so oh how is one of word text 3 bit and as deep as no down with the some other weird how do the game you want to run you gonna look at a chef the age card take into the notion oh or circle that ranging because me flavor that letter no so but tell me one part risk them again just do it she has got or make it turn to stop doing already on Nisa you're up like look at it every day look at it again when neither doing the ice safety type wait then sometimes every coming points there is heavily lifted to it run that in the box I'm living scary in this whole rear on place I'm so read so I'm with Lord I'm really about turn not this again to something we went not to be on if you do seal or when animal listens limited now they would be third and kill the middle grief to hearing on even regulation that happy to add is news gate to all every animal one listening here next this year with you mission to remember once even if anything else is on the Bible my fantastic job and offset at something because you treating live at for channel the yes and you won't forget this wing only hotel the third bit you bring have these to be here and not there that's when me critical people certain needs and my sound hot look so I selection of next CV keep smart muckles for those kind of them see sure I was having spending long maybe and then just only after the Jimmy everybody this is still big maybe so must start check let's think heading for one good fun in the west what did it monially or with this never know but they're watching twins now being is an irritant seems like near in church was forget to cook them him ends up speaks something with was there were just spent his all like idea when you leave nine like stove if he is on a ship wing this out on time say the second Martin and never makes not a rip either just ready to is a big express max there's no access to another nine pro why was more I just all pack up I'm sure looking at the guesses and shut your own stuff work like doing next event that went into the taxes there but you're kind of like that tax on the secret minor do it retain iron operating over I'm just like I know I can iron there's one more meeting my left so we can be yes you can have these and it's many to stay on doing she's worried you look like a scroll people with let me just have to win it's skill weird for the dealers that's or we little never no for fire to even and like and leave I'm all the bricks I got a coin there they no like those switch lean here is sad back with her they all have that's all to do it miss him holy I'm again break it's not your that's fine I know those but I'm tired of taking it but these get it later what was like garage like Thanks for all this and lonely and you're every night. Powering my snap. Yeah, we never skip about I am at zipping tea. There's nothing zip hill. That was the zip. It's rid of none. It's a bit worker in the clear. The one under my you could do it. No, I never need to be. Name it club mission for a start the chance hand the game pumps about a bit. No, I see when a curse one. See, said, I have given me from some space. It's not in a now, them, urban and words. It's sending suppose and inches the all way. Mapping give me those are room milk right up to the line to. Girl is just a box. When he's all working as well. I should believe, what important is to do it. And then you have never risk was and it was awesome.
Suspected her sharp tongue hid a kind heart. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple reflected on the case's deeper lessons. Evelyn's courage had been her undoing, yet it had also been the spark that illuminated the truth. So like my nephew's daughter, Dolly, Miss Marple mused, recalling a village girl whose curiosity often led to small mischiefs. But Evelyn's curiosity uncovered a darkness far greater than village gossip. The smuggling cartel, orchestrated by Señor Diego Alvarez, was a reminder that greed could corrupt even the most genteel settings, turning a family's home into a stage for murder. Her reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was the vicar's wife, Mrs. Price, bearing a basket of apples from the vicarage orchard. "Jane," she said, settling into a chair, "the village is abuzz with talk of your time at Blackthorn Manor. They say you solved a murder single-handedly." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Oh, my dear, the police did all the hard work. I merely noticed a few things, small details, like the way a person's hands tremble or the ink on a cuff. People reveal themselves, if you watch closely." Mrs. Price laughed, shaking her head. "You're too modest, Jane. But tell me, how do you stay so calm amidst such horrors?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression thoughtful. "I suppose it's because I believe in order, Mrs. Price. The world is full of tangles, greed, fear, betrayal. But beneath it all, there is a pattern. My little gray cells, as a dear friend once called them, simply seek to trace it." As Mrs. Price left, Miss Marple took a final walk through her garden, the roses now fading, but still fragrant. She paused by a bench, her thoughts returning to Evelyn's diary and the young woman's desperate need to protect her family. We all seek to protect something, she thought, but we must choose our methods wisely. Back in her parlor, she resumed her knitting, the shawl taking shape under her deft hands. The case of Blackthorn Manor was closed, its secrets laid bare, but Miss Marple knew that life, like her knitting, would always bring new patterns to unravel. The quiet of St. Mary Mead was her sanctuary, a place where she could watch and listen, ready for the next mystery that might cross her path. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the village, Miss Marple smiled softly, her needles clicking in time with her thoughts. "The world is never without its shadows," she murmured, "but a single thread of truth can light the way." And with that, she turned her attention to the evening, content in the knowledge that, for now, justice had prevailed, and the little